What's up, everybody, and welcome in to another edition of the Sitdown. As always, if you enjoy this video, please make sure you hit that like button and let me know what you think of today's very interesting discussion in the comment section below. If you're new around here, you just haven't done it yet, or living under a rock and seeing this video for the first time, I don't know what you're waiting for. Hit that subscribe button below now so you never miss another Sit-Down video. Also, if you're listening to us currently on iTunes or Spotify, welcome in. I hope you enjoy the show. As always, make sure you leave us a detailed review and a 5-star rating. Welcome in, everybody. This is episode 168 of the Sit-Down, and I'm your host, Jeff Nadu. Also, if you enjoy cigars, a shameless plug, check out our signature sit-down cigar, available now from Pravada Cigar Club. The link to buy is in the description of this video and audio. I hope you're all having a great week. It is damn hot out there, but it's the middle of the summer. We're kind of at that period where we're looking forward a little bit to fall. I know all of us are looking forward to the cooler temperatures. It's the middle of July. It's hot. We got a great show planned for you today, as always. Before though we get into the episode, I do want to apologize about last week's episode involving Jerry Finnegan, corrupt Chicago cop. Unfortunately, the sound was a bit of a problem, which I apologize about. When we uploaded it, it sounded like it was on par and okay, but I do apologize. And I guarantee today we'll make up for last week's episode. I'm asked the question all the time, Jeff, who's your favorite gangster? Who are you most fascinated by? And when someone asks me that, I always think to myself, well, I'm not really like a fanboy. Like, I don't have a favorite. I find certain guys really interesting. You know, Vincent Gigante, Tony Salerno, even like a John Gotti, Joey Merlino. Then I start to really think, and I think, well, to me, I've always said the guys that become truly transcendent mobsters are the guys that can do both. The guys that are depraved but can also make a lot of money. And today's subject, you've probably never heard of. But what if I told you at one point he was considered by one guy that said he was the most dangerous man in Cosa Nostra, and if he aligned with the right people, he could take over the American Mafia? Let's get into the story of Joseph Hoboken Joe Stassi next on the Sit-Down. That was said about Joe Stassi that he made his bones with the Jews. And that's exactly right. Joseph Stassi is really an enigma. He's a guy who, again, had the respect of Meyer Lansky, Santo Trafficante, Angelo Bruno. This guy was a very vicious enforcer, but he was a very vicious businessman too. He had the ability to do whatever he wanted. This is a guy that was at one point the mob's point man in Havana, Cuba. This is a guy who down the road made a humongous amount of money selling heroin. This guy was on the forefront of everything, and we're going to delve into him today. I really went deep on Joseph Stassi. I find him just incredibly fascinating. And we're going to talk about some of the FBI files that I found about Joe Stassi. And, you know, there are people out there that I've heard that say some of the things you read about Joseph Stassi, you can't believe. But then there's a lot of backing up everything he said. He's a guy who lived, you know, into his mid-90s. Joe Stassi was born way back on December 2nd, 1906. And he was actually born in New York City. He was from the area of Stanton Street, down on the Lower East Side, near the area of Soho, Chinatown. It was said that both Joe Stassi's parents were from Sicily, and I had trouble with some of the ancestry records in reading some of the writing about where they were actually from. But it was said that Joseph Stassi, his parents, Giuseppe and Anna, were from Sicily, and his father came over in 1892, according to ancestry records. His mom would follow in 1896. Now, Joe Stassi's father, His listed occupation was a street cleaner, according to census records. And the two, Anna and Giuseppe, had 8 children. And what's interesting about Joseph Stassi is 2 of his brothers, James and Anthony, would actually follow him into the life as well. Now, what's interesting as well about Joseph Stassi is he would only go to about 7th grade, and then he would take to the streets. And around those times in the early 20s, when Joe was, let's say 14, 15 years old, bootlegging was a huge thing. Everybody was doing it. And he wanted to catch the eye of local mobsters in the area. Now, his criminal record would start in the 1920s. Joseph Stassi would be arrested on various charges, including gun and robbery arrests. So it was likely that he was probably, out there sticking people up, wasn't allowed to possess firearms, and was pinched, which back in those days was difficult to be caught. By the late 20s, he began working for Jewish racketeer in New Jersey, Abner Longy Zwillman. Now, Zwillman really made a shit ton of money. He was called the Al Capone of New Jersey. He was involved heavily in bootlegging, numbers rackets, gambling. This guy made a lot of money. And according to the 1940 census, Joe Stassi would move most of his operations to New Jersey. He would live in the area of 955 Harding Road in Elizabeth, New Jersey. Now, Elizabeth in those days was what we would call today DeCavalcanti territory. And some of the early people in the DeCavalcanti crime family we can trace to Joseph Stassi. Now, what's interesting about the home that Joe Stassi lived in alongside his wife, Estelle, in 1940, the house was listed for about $20,000, which today would mean that house was worth about 450 grand. So Joe Stassi lived in luxury. Keep in mind, he was only in his early 30s in 1940, and he had already made a bunch of money due to the fact that he was very close with Longy Zwillman. And it was said that a lot of the early money that Joe Stassi made was from his involvement and overseeing of various numbers rackets out of New Jersey. Now, when we say numbers racket, what do we mean? Well, the illegal lottery, right? You can make a lot of money with these dice game, lottery game type things because, again, look at the lottery in today's day and age. I mean, you're talking about millions, billions of dollars to hit a number. So these guys are making a bunch of money. That's how Tony Salerno made his fortune. He had not only control of the numbers racket, but he had control of everyone else involved in the numbers racket, whether it was Cuban, black, whatever. Tony took a piece, and we can almost guess that Joe Stassi took a piece as well. Now, one thing about Joe Stassi we would also learn is that he was a very trusted hitter. In fact, he had the respect of people like Longy Zwillman. He had the respect of people like Meyer Lansky. And I'm going to talk about that here when we get into bootlegging. It's said that Joe Stassi was one of the people that not only took out Dutch Schultz, he also may have been involved in planning the execution of Albert Anastasia. And I want to talk about in 1933 who he's tasked with killing. There was a man in Pennsylvania who was called the Beer Baron of Reading, Pennsylvania. His name was Max Hassel. Now, Max Hassel had breweries and, ale houses and all sorts of places all around Pennsylvania. Reading, York, Lancaster, all over the place. This guy was a very rich bootlegger, on the level of, George Remus, guys like that. This guy's making a lot of money in bootlegging. And as we've seen in shows like Boardwalk Empire, a cohort or commission, if you will, was set up where everyone kind of ran bootlegging together in sort of like a coerced like ballet. And Max Hassel in 1933 did not want to get down or laid down. Now, according to what we know, territory was everything to a mob regardless of ethnicity, and that the Italian, Jewish, and Irish mobs supplying New York from within the city and New Jersey were often at odds. And while he was well connected, Max Hassel was entering into deep waters. Now, he had been advised better to be a big fish in a small pond than sleep with the fishes in the deep blue sea. And he would eventually move his operations to North Jersey. One of the first people that Max Hassel befriends is a person called Hoboken Joe Stassi. That they would become so close that at one point, Stassi would actually move right below where Max Hassel lived in the Carteret Hotel in Elizabeth. Now, at one point, Joe Stassi's having dinner with both Longies Woolman and Meyer Lansky. And they're just having dinner and they finish. And there's a guy to Philadelphia called Waxy Gordon. And Waxy says, essentially, everybody's in on this except for Max Hassel. Longy would respond, Maxie's big head is getting too big for his hat band, if you ask me. Waxy would respond, don't look at me. I tried talking sense into him. Max is bound and determined. Now, Meyer Lansky, it was said, then looked at Hoboken Joe Stassi and said, quote, take care of them. Mustering all the control of a hardened killer, Stassi would respond saying, quote, I'm on it, boss. That would lead us to April 13th, 1933, a week after the repeal is permitted. And what happens? Max Hassel is killed. A lot of people believe that one of the people that were gunmen in this were Joe Stassi. And he was either directly connected to it or directly connected to planning the execution of Max Hassel, the beer baron of Reading, Pennsylvania. So again, this guy is very trusted. Keep in mind, in 1933, he's in his mid-20s, Joe Stassi. Very young guy, but very well receptive. Because again, he was a hitter, he followed directions, and he was connected to the right people. Longies Woolman was only about 2 years older than Joe Stassi, but they had an incredibly connected way of thinking. And people like Meyer Lansky were very trusting of Joe Stassi as well. Now, it's also said that in 1935, he would put a plan together to whack Jewish racketeer Dutch Schultz. Now, Longies Woolman would then take over Dutch Schultz's rackets. And again, by this point, Joseph Stassi is living in New Jersey and he has major connections. He's essentially a protege to people like Meyer Lansky. Now, what we don't know is what family Joe Stassi was connected to. This has always been a really interesting kind of what if, because there are various charts, there are various people, there are various Senate reports that say that Joe Stassi was a made member in the Gambino crime family. And we have direct connection to him with people like Carlo Gambino. It's said that he was made approximately in the early 40s. That said, though, according to Joseph Falacci and according to Senate records, in 1963, he's identified as a member of the Genovese crime family and is under Jerry Katina. Though, when we read into some of the things that he was doing in Cuba, it may have been that he was just kind of a roving guy who had no family that he belonged to, but was respected by everybody, which is kind of interesting. Now, I want to talk about Joe Stassi's involvement down in Havana, Cuba, because as we know, by the late 40s, Havana is looked at as open territory. It's a beach paradise where you could put a bunch of hotels and casinos, and it's essentially Las Vegas with a beach. The mobsters take it over. And in 1947, there's something called the Havana Conference, which happens in Cuba. Lucky Luciano's there. All these bigwig mobsters are there. And the talk is taking over Cuba through the relationship the mob had with Fulgencio Batista, who ran Cuba, and also selling narcotics. Which, again, when we look into Joe Stassi, I think a lot of his early money was through selling illegal narcotics. Because if you know anything about Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, all these guys, they made a lot of money selling opium. And we would find down the road, Joseph Stassi and his brothers also very much have connections to selling narcotics. Joe Stassi views Havana as, the next place in line. And what he starts doing is investing a shit ton of money into Havana. All the money that he has, he invests in hotels and casinos. And I would actually find some government records that actually prove that. Now, he would be nicknamed Hoboken Joe or Joe Rogers. And according to several figures, as I said, he answered directly to the Genovese crime family. And again, through his relationship with Meyer Lansky, he likely knew Lucky Luciano, Jerry Katina. We can venture to believe that he likely belonged to the Genovese crime family, though then you find that there's a lot of connections to the DeCavalcantes, the early DeCavalcante family, the fact that he was in New Jersey. But then again, he also knew Angelo Bruno. He knew guys in the Gambino family. So it's kind of interesting. Now, I want to talk about a federal memo that I found in 1958 relating to a place called the San Suchi, which was a restaurant and a nightclub. It also had a casino. It was like a garden type restaurant. According to a document in an FBI file from the government, the principal owners in this casino continue to be Santo Trafficante Jr. and Joseph Stassi, also known as Joe Rogers, and Jimmy Baker, who was a brother-in-law of Dino Cellini and was formerly in charge of the Kisoka, a small gambling casino that is adjunct of the San Suchi, in which frequented by a poor money crowd. We would also learn that at one point, Joe Rogers was also the principal owner and money interest in the old Hotel Plaza in downtown Havana, and that he was looking to take that, remodel it into a gambling paradise. This is the Hotel Plaza in downtown Havana. So Joseph Stassi saw the future and what gambling meant, and that he could sink his fortune into Cuba and the money would come, the money would flow. Nobody knew that in 1959, a communist leader was going to come in, take it over. The mob believed that even with Fidel Castro in control, he would still allow gambling to happen and, would allow the mob to do what they wanted because they were the mob. So he sunk most of his fortune into that. So again, we have government files that produce that Joseph Stassi was a very connected person. And one person that I read about will call him the day-to-day point man for the Mafia in Havana. And we actually have both airline and ship records that he left and entered Miami and left the country multiple times. There's even, which is very interesting, in the early 50s, I found a ship record that Joseph Stassi went to Rotterdam, which is in the Netherlands. And I'm unsure why he went there, maybe to pass through and go somewhere else. But this guy was a jet setter. He was all over the place, and he was making a lot of money. That was until 1959 when communist forces move in, Castro comes in and takes over. And this was a major problem for people like, Meyer Lansky, who made it clear he lost a lot of money. Santo Trafficante Jr., who very much was close to Joe Stassi himself. These guys sunk their entire fortunes into Cuba. And again, they thought, well, Castro comes in, he'll still let us do gambling because we're the mob. Didn't happen. And they lost a fortune. That said, in the early 60s, Joe Stassi decides to go back to his bread and butter, which we would learn is narcotics. And remember, one thing they also talked about at the Havana conference is, how do we take over the drug game? There's a lot of money in H, a lot of money in weed, a lot of money in this. The French Connection is set. It was said that Stassi was very close to people like Carmine Galanti. Remember, he was Sicilian in the end, and that was a very important thing to being involved in the drug trade. So what we start finding is Joseph Stassi starts making regular trips to Mexico. And we would find out that in the early 60s, he is trying to import pounds and pounds of H on the regular. And he's making a bunch of money in the process. There was also thought that he was taking out people that weren't doing what he was saying, whether it was nightclub owners or people. There was untold amount of bodies that Joe Stassi allegedly had. And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. But I want to talk about this drug thing that they found. According to his case, the government would claim that there was no question that the conspiracy involving Joe Stassi was a big-time operation involving real underworld characters. Now, there were 6 shipments known to the government when Stassi was involved a total of more than 100 pounds of contraband, not the Mexican type of drug that is radically cut with powdered sugar or other substances before crossing the border, but almost pure heroin. Now, one of the shipments consisted of 22 pounds, 12 ounces, and it was the only one that was seized by officials. The other 5 had taken place before the government learned of the smuggling. Now, that shipment was also involved in the trial of multiple people, including a person who was a Cuban national called Jose Marin. Now, Jose Marin was said to be one of the connects that Joe Stassi was dealing with. And we would venture to believe that Joe Stassi likely met Jose Marin while he was in Cuba. Now, we would also learn that the suitcase contained 22 pounds of 99.3% pure H, and it was valued at nearly $11 million. Now, the payments by Granza and Ferreira, who were named in the indictment for each of these shipments they brought from Stassi, were so bulky that the currency had to be carried in large grocery sacks and big shoe boxes. Now, according to what we also know, Marin had been engaged in narcotic traffic in from the United States for more than 10 years, and Stassi had been a professional gambler and was the owner of one of the largest casinos in Havana at the time Castro closed them down. Now, the stature of Stassi, Granza, and Ferreira in the underworld is revealed by the fact that all of these large shipments of H were delivered to them entirely on credit, which was practically unheard of in narcotics. That's how well respected Joseph Stassi was. Think about the amount of money we're talking about here. This is the early 60s. And for one shipment, $10-11 million for one shipment. They mentioned 6 shipments, and 5 of them got past the people looking into this. Now, according to what we know about Stassi, he would make it clear that, yeah, he was in Mexico, but he was the owner and operator of the San Souci Gambling Casino and the National Hotel in Havana. And at the time Castro took over, he left Cuba when Castro closed professional gaming, and he made numerous trips to Mexico looking for legitimate investments, according to him. His counsel related that theory to the jury and also went into the defense witness, and that he did not testify, and there was no explanation for his number of aliases and getting plane tickets and registering in hotels in Mexico if the objects of the trip were legitimate. So he claimed, yeah, I was in Mexico, but I was looking for legit opportunities with legit businesses. He then becomes a fugitive, and we don't hear from Joe Stassi for a long period of time. And again, there he was also wanted in taking part of the murder of a person called Kenneth Later, who was a nightclub owner in New York City. He would eventually be arrested in 1966 in Florida, and would be convicted of attempting to smuggle 22 pounds of H into America. So there it goes. He's convicted. On the surface, he's given 18 years. It does not stop, though, for Joe Stassi, because as he knows, there's a lot of money in selling narcotics. Now, according to the government in the Southern District of New York, Both he and his brother, a person called Anthony Stassi, were convicted of conspiracy to import and distribute H between 1970 and 1972 and selling 40 kilos 1 year alone and importing and distributing 70 kilos in 1971. This all happens while he's behind the wall in federal prison. He gets hit again through his relationship with a person that we would learn of called Jean-Claude Otvas. He was another inmate at USP Atlanta and a fellow conspirator. He was deported in 1975. So in all, he gets hit with about 31 years in federal prison for conspiracy to distribute H. And by this point in the early 70s, Joseph Stassi is one of the biggest drug dealers in America. In fact, in a 1979 article from the Arizona Republic, they would identify Joe Stassi as one of the chief people in the narcotics trade. And at that point in 1972 or 1979, Joseph Stassi is 72 years old. Now, they would identify him as, quote, a member of the Gambino family. He was one of the many people that was run out of Havana after Castro's takeover of Cuba, and that he was involved in a gambling casino with Santo Trafficante, the mob boss in Tampa. He was picked up on his first narcotics arrest in Florida in 1966, and he would evade the government for nearly 3 years until his arrest. And we talked about that in 1966. Now, while in prison, he was accused of conspiring to bring 13 pounds of H into the United States and again received a lengthy prison sentence. Now, Stassi was also believed by law enforcement authorities to be involved in the 1963 disappearance of nightclub agent Kenneth Lader, who made several trips to Mexico, believed that he was connected with his trafficking ring, and later remains were discovered in a mob burial ground in South Jersey. Also mentioned in this article were people like Charlie Beck Palermo, Charles Odo, big-time people, Carmine Galante, big-time drug dealers. This guy was an enigma, Joe Stassi. He made a ton of money. Now, at one point, I want to talk about obviously Carmine Galante, but I also want to talk about this guy, a person called K.O. Koningsberg. Now, K.O. Koningsberg has been very vocal about Joseph Stassi over the years. K.O. Koningsberg was a Jewish hitman for the Genovese and Bonanno crime families, and he provided all sorts of information about various gangsters over the years. And he would talk about who he believed was a real motherfucker, and he believed who was kind of a weak guy, right? He would at one point identify Sam DeCalvacanti as a very weak person. He was also asked, who was the most dangerous person you've ever been around? At one point, he would call Joseph Stassi a cold-blooded killer and worse than Murder Inc., and that he likely had more bodies than Murder Inc. That's how feared Joe Stassi was. K.O. Koningsberg would also say at one point that Joseph Stassi would kill his own wife and kids if he found out they were informants for the federal government. That's how cold-blooded this guy was. He would also call him, quote, the most dangerous man in Cosa Nostra, and that if he ever was able to conspire alongside Carmine Galante, a guy he knew very well, they could take over the Mafia. And as we know, one of the reasons Galante is whacked in 1979 was for trying to do just that, take over the Mafia. He didn't want to share in what he was doing. This guy, Joe Stassi, was extremely powerful. The problem that he had was he had spent his last decade or so in prison. In the end, Joseph Stassi would spend 30 years in federal prison. He went in around 1966 and wasn't released until 1996. At the time of Joe Stassi's release, he was 90 years old. So 1996, he's 90. Think about that. That's how long this guy goes back. And here we can see in this article, he's pinched. 37, arrested in New Jersey crime ring. And he's listed as a member of the Gambino crime family alongside James Stassi and his other brother, Anthony Stassi. Joe Stassi was as real as it gets, and he had been around since the 20s. He'd been taking people out for guys like Meyer Lansky and, people like that. Longie's Willman. It was said that Joseph Stassi, according to Social Security records, would retire in Green Valley, Arizona, out in picturesque southwest of the United States, and would die in October 2002 at the age of 96. This is Joe Stassi much later in his life. A guy who really, could you imagine speaking to this guy? Like, could you imagine sitting down and just chatting about all the things he had seen in his life? This is a guy who was on the forefront of casino gaming in Cuba. This is a guy who, was doing hits for Meyer Lansky of bootleggers in the 30s. He may have been involved with whacking Dutch Schultz. And many people believe that he was involved directly in planning the murder of Albert Anastasia back in the 50s. Now, I spoke to a couple of people and I asked them, what family was Joseph Stassi with? And it's really always been a point of contention. Some people say he was a Genovese member. And according to a 1963 family membership chart, he's listed as a Genovese member alongside, many others that we know that were a part of the Genovese family. Now, there's also record, as I said, including that newspaper article that identify him as a Gambino family member. It's really interesting. From what I kind of gathered is Joe Stassi was kind of a neutral figure. And that's what he was called in Cuba, a neutral figure that everybody knew when he came around. He spoke not only for the mob, but he was not to be screwed around with. Maybe similar to like a D. Bernardo from the Gambino family. He didn't necessarily have people under him and he was allowed to operate and was left alone for the most part. Just a really interesting, fascinating figure to me. I've always been really, really interested in kind of the guy that Joseph Stassi was. The guy made a bunch of money and he did it like early in his life. This guy was in his, his 30s and 40s, and the guy was making just an amazingly big amount of money. And as I said, this guy had a $400,000 or $500,000 home in the early 40s, according to what we know from records of what stuff was worth back then. Now, K.O. Koenigsberg will call Joe Stassi the world's coldest killer. He had nerves of iron and is the smoothest killer alive today. Which is, that's pretty crazy to say. So, again, you don't need to take my word for it. Does this guy look like a killer? Maybe not then, but he had more bodies than Murder Inc., according to people. And this is how you become very respected. You do what you're told. You take people out and you make a bunch of money. And guys like Meyer Lansky said, hey, take care of this. And he took care of it. When you look back on the mob, you never mention guys like Joe Stassi, but this guy was super powerful, super interesting, and super well connected. As I said, Joe Stassi would die at the age of 96 in 2002. Again, could you imagine sitting down and just talking to that guy? Crazy. It's sad that so many stories will die with the people that lived the life. It's really, I think, one of the saddest parts of this genre is that we never hear from these kind of people. So that's that for the show this week. I was really interested in this one. I've heard the name Joe Stassi before, and again, a lot of it comes from K.O. Koenigsberg, who, again, said a lot of things about a lot of people. But there's a lot of proof in what he says. He would also directly say he wasn't scared of anybody, but if somebody needed to be removed, Joe Stassi would deal with it. So in the end, he got a little too greedy, needed to make a bunch of money, and knew that the only way to make money was selling narcotics, which he made a fortune doing as well. So that's that for the show this week. I hope you enjoyed this video. Again, I apologize last week for the audio. Hope it's much better this week, which I'm sure it is. I will see you all again next week. And yeah, try to stay cool. Hope you enjoy the show. If you do enjoy what we're doing, you want to support us further, make sure you hit that super thanks icon. Support the show. And yeah, hit that like button on your way out. We'll see you next week here on the Sit Down.